Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me in the back? So I don't have to use this. No, that's too strong. As Walter said, the foundation of this talk that I will be giving is on the two basic powers of government. Now, you actually don't find these two powers mentioned in the United States Constitution, or as far as I'm aware, in any state constitution. It goes back to basic political philosophy. So I suppose I have to define them. Power of the sword, ultimately, is the power of whatever the sovereign body controlling the lawmaking process of a nation can exert ultimately through force. Because all laws are ultimately enforced through force against those individuals who refuse to comply. In most societies, vast majorities of the laws are enforced simply through voluntary compliance, but in the ultimate analysis, there are those people who will, for one reason or another, refuse to comply with the laws, and then force needs to be applied. Now, the power of the purse is exactly what it sounds like. It's the power over wealth, and typically the power over money in any kind of complex society that's advanced beyond the barter stage. And under the United States Constitution, it involves essentially four elements: the power to tax, the power to borrow, the power to spend, because all governments not only receive, but they put out funds, and power with relation to money of one kind or another. We'll get to that, how that exactly ties in a moment. Under the United States Constitution, the power of the sword ultimately resides in we the people, because we the people are the ultimate sovereign body. How does the Constitution itself begin? We the people of the United States, for these purposes, do ordain and establish this Constitution. So, the people being the sovereign, under this very old theory of governmental organization, the people have to control, ultimately, both the power of the purse and the power of the sword. Now, I became interested in this subject, this relationship with the power of the sword, the constitutional Homeland Security question, because of the Homeland Security problem that developed after the 9/11 episode. Actually, it was in the works before the 9/11 episode. The 9/11 episode was essentially the trigger that allowed people in Washington to do certain things they'd already been planning to do for a long time. And I sat around for a year or two expecting some other people from the constitutionalist or traditional conservative libertarian perspective, what have you, to do something with respect to this problem. They never did. So as a result, I ended up writing this particular book. Now, it's all pretty simple-minded. The Constitution was written by the people to be read and understood and applied by the people. One doesn't have to have 4 degrees from Harvard. One doesn't have to have 1 degree from Harvard, really, to be able to understand it. Probably you're better off not having any degrees from Harvard today. Because you have to wade through so much disinformation that's already out there, provided by people from Harvard, among other leading schools. It was meant to be understood by the people, and if you look at the Constitution from the perspective of this term, Homeland Security, which I admit was invented, in a sense, by the other side, if you will, by the people in Washington that are looking to create a certain kind of top-down structure to control this country. But let's use their terminology. It takes a crooked stick to beat a mad dog, if you know what I mean. Right? Let's use their terminology. Where do you find the word security in the United States Constitution? Well, the only place it appears is the Second Amendment. Well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. And of course it is linked to a free state. So we're talking about really a political institution and a political purpose. Security is designed in the United States Constitution to relate to this thing called a state, which is a political institution, and a peculiar kind of state, a free state, as opposed to the opposite, which is a police state. All right? Now once again, one doesn't have to be a Harvard graduate to see this. It's right there. Now that same amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Well, that is the only place in the Constitution where the Constitution says that anything is necessary for any purpose. Doesn't say Congress is necessary, doesn't say the President is necessary, the Supreme Court is not said to be necessary, doesn't say the Army is necessary or the Navy. Just this thing called a well-regulated militia. And in the body of the Constitution, that is the original Constitution before the Bill of Rights or any other amendments were ratified, if you go to Article 1, Section 8, clauses 15 and 16, you'll see the relationship of Congress to the militia. And one of the interesting parts of those two clauses is the power of Congress to provide for calling forth the militia for certain purposes. And there are three of them, and only three of them. To execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. That's a pretty good list of Homeland Security activities. It pretty much covers the waterfront in a sense. Probably not too much that you couldn't fit in under that list. Well, said the militia are the only institutions that are explicitly given this authority. So one would think that if you were sitting down, knew nothing else but the Constitution of the United States, and you came upon this problem of how do we devise a system to provide for Homeland Security, to deal with everything from a natural disaster to a pandemic to a terrorist strike to perhaps the result of thermonuclear war, you know, propose any scenario you want, catastrophic scenario. How, using the Constitution, would you devise such a structure? Well, I don't think you'd create something called the Department of Homeland Security. That wouldn't come to mind right away. It certainly isn't mentioned in the Constitution. The only department of the executive branch that is mentioned is the Treasury Department, going back to the power of the purse. Certainly don't mention any kind of security department in the Constitution. The Army is mentioned and the Navy is mentioned, but it never says anywhere in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights that those are necessary functions. And if you knew anything about pre-constitutional history, you'd know that the Founding Fathers were very leery of a standing army. They had run across a standing army under General Gage in Boston, among other places. So they had a certain amount of suspicion of that institution. So you wouldn't imagine that that would be the one, if you were picking anything out of the Constitution that was at least explicitly mentioned. And then here's this one called the militia of the several states. In fact, that's the exact terminology for it, which the Second Amendment says is necessary for the security of a free state, and Congress is given the power to provide for calling this thing out to perform these Homeland Security functions. So one would say, by looking at the Constitution, any Homeland Security structure has to be built upon these institutions called the militia of the several states, at least first. And if for some reason or other those institutions failed, then you might go to the next step, which might be the Army. You might go to the next step, might be some executive department created under the President or what have you. But certainly those would be down the line of organization, at least in terms of looking at this problem from the constitutional perspective. All right, well, what's the short answer to this? Is this what Congress has done? Well, no, it's done exactly the opposite, typically, of Congress. All right, set the jackass on its head, if you will. And we have a top-down structure organized from the District of Columbia to reach down into every state and locality with some element of control. And you ask yourself, well, what's wrong with that in principle? Well, it's not the structure of the militia. How do I know that? Go back to the Constitution. The Constitution has many terms in it that are not defined. Militia of the several states happens to be one of them. Well-regulated militia. Never is there a definition given. But most of the terms in the Constitution, a definition isn't given. The Constitution is not a dictionary. It was assumed that people at that time knew what most of its terms meant and had a reasonable grounding in the English language so they could put them together in terms of syntax and interpretation. Now you find some words defined. Treason is a good example. The very specific and narrow definition of treason. Why? Because under the English law, remember all of these colonies came out of the English system, so they all at one time or other had adopted more or less of the English legal system. Treason was very broadly defined because it was used as a methodology for suppressing political dissent or political opposition. So every time a new form of